Hi, everyone, and thanks for your time to watch and listen to our message. Coastal Communities United is a little nonprofit with big goals, and while we've been fighting hard behind the scenes, it's time to talk more openly about what we've been up to. Through our dedicated research, we've uncovered many detailed regulatory concerns, which we outlined in a letter to the Savannah District Corps of Engineers on March 3rd. CCU's had a big hand in supporting all the data collection, research, and analysis that became the basis for the federal permit challenge. Key activities include open records requests for state documents and Freedom of Information Act or FOIA requests for federal documents. We've scoured these documents on many late nights to link revelations of just how all this came about. While the case was coming together to publish the letter of intent to sue the Corps of Engineers, CCU supported the Riverkeeper, collaborating with several organizations to share our analysis. The issues related to the environmental impacts analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, became clear. After our initial analysis was shared, we have continued to collaborate with the Riverkeeper as well as science and legal experts in adverse impacts from groundwater withdrawals in the regional Floridan aquifer system. We have also continued filing records requests, building more of the case. Still are. We really don't quit. We spoke up about this at the meeting EPD held back in August. Let's take a moment to hear a few words from our founder and director.
The people of Georgia demand accountability on your agency to work to protect our water. When did cost to a corporation take precedent over what is best for the region and its people and resources? Surface water is available now. It was decided by a board of unelected officials that it was cheaper and quicker to use well water. Surface water can come now from Savannah's industrial and domestic water treatment plant in Richmond Hill. We don't need a 25-year timeline. Make them use surface water now.
A good follow-up to those words from our founder and director is the question of what got us here. It's not just a lack of proper planning, but money and meeting a go-to market timeline for industry. You've probably read the same articles I have that point out the JDA had been working to develop this site for more than 10 years, along the same time frame that they gave about needing to get surface water to the site. But let's take a look at the boldest admission and root of the problem: money and time saved, all to meet a go-to market timeline for a corporation. Putting in the groundwater wells saved $362 million, or nearly 5% of the budget for the project, and the wells were 7 years quicker. Well, time and money are not reasons to accept or overlook significant impacts to the environment. Let's take a step back and talk about environmental impacts. A mini lesson on the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which requires federal agencies to integrate environmental values into their decision-making processes. They make federal agencies consider the environmental impacts of the proposed actions and some reasonable alternatives. You must also consider connected actions and cumulative impacts. And if a significant impact is anticipated or either identified in an environmental assessment, then an environmental impact statement is required. The Corps of Engineers regulates the Clean Water Act, Section 404 permit process for impacts to wetlands or other waters of the state, as it's said in the regulation. The development of the megasite required a 404 application and permit because of the amount of wetlands, over 200 acres, that it was going to fill and impact. The approval or issuing of the 404 permit was a major federal action that the Corps of Engineers then had to do environmental impacts analysis, or NEPA, on. Not being told about the water demands for the megasite caused the Corps to overlook what we argue are significant impacts. There was a careful timeline of misinformation. In a nutshell, the JDA told Hyundai in April of 22 that groundwater wells would be constructed to meet the water needs for the site. Then 2 months later told the Corps of Engineers utilities were available and no groundwater permits would be needed. Fast forward nearly 2 years, and we all hear about the groundwater wells in Bullock County to serve a site in Bryan County that's constructed already. And the EPD models impacts of up to 19 feet of drawdown on the aquifer, requiring a mitigation fund, though the Corps said no significant impact. Then the governor just released the budget for 26 and amended budget for 25, calling for $500 million of surface water infrastructure to serve coastal Georgia's unprecedented growth. Without the mega site, we wouldn't have that growth. It's all connected, and every bit of it should have been part of the Corps' analysis of cumulative impacts to get a true idea of what environmental impacts would be associated with the development and permitting of the mega site. Meanwhile, the EPD is working to assess impacts of the 4 groundwater wells in Bullock County, and some weekly staff meeting notes show unreasonable adverse effects to public water systems at Eldora Farms and Olney Station, citing 32 to 41 feet of drawdown. The information EPD presented back in August focused on private wells, saying nothing more than 19 feet, certainly nothing over the 30 feet mark they consider adverse. But for public water systems, they had already identified unreasonable adverse impacts nearly 2 years prior. Looking at the deeper details, back in 2019 when the site was proposed to be a gas-powered vehicle manufacturing facility, they did a 404 permit application and NEPA analysis. Then the plan changed and it became an EV site, adding hundreds more acres to the site plan. A 404 permit modification and related NEPA was done, though we argue not to the extent required due to the missing information on the groundwater demands, coupled with the $500 million of surface water infrastructure that's required to meet water demands of the site for the long term. So in April of 2022, JDA told Hyundai that they would have to have 4 groundwater wells to serve the site, and then 2 months later filled out a 404 permit application that said utilities were available and no new groundwater permits would be needed. In September of 22, Bryan County wrote a letter to EPD about the groundwater needs of 4 wells in Bullock County to serve the megasite. The next month, the Corps declared in its updated NEPA analysis that there would be no significant impacts, making no mention of water needs expected, saying it would be reasonable to assume that Bryan County's municipal supply would be adequate to serve the needs of the site. How could that possibly be true? In February of 24, EPD released their estimates of drawdown on the aquifer, showing that 19 feet worst-case scenario. By June, Ogeechee Riverkeeper filed an intent to sue the Corps of Engineers for their incomplete and inaccurate analysis. The Corps acknowledged the groundwater demands for the site changed things in letters to both the Riverkeeper and the JDA in August, demanding the JDA provide information on how the groundwater withdrawals would impact both ground and surface waters. In October, the EPD issued the final groundwater permits for the wells in Bullock County. Meanwhile, we stayed at work gathering info, asking questions. EPD acknowledged there were no requirements for the individuals who would oversee the mitigation funds. Now, it looks like Bullock County's doing a good job with that, but EPD didn't require any special background for the folks who would oversee making whole of people losing their water. We just saw the governor's mid-year budget, which calls for over $1 billion of water infrastructure across the state, with over $500 million going to surface water infrastructure in coastal Georgia. This was clearly triggered by the development of the megasite, and it appears we are about to mix surface and groundwater to meet regional needs, when citizens should have been able to continue relying on the groundwater resources for years to come, at least in much of our region. Last week, our letter to the Corps of Engineers outlined 5 key issues, the largest being the significant groundwater withdrawals and how that triggers the need for an environmental impact statement to satisfy the NEPA requirement. We should have more detailed impacts analysis than environmental assessment and EA. That's small potatoes, and the megasite is not small potatoes. We're also pointing out flaws in the state's groundwater modeling. That looks at one thing, one proposed project at a time. It doesn't meet the requirement for the Corps of Engineers NEPA that's supposed to look at cumulative impacts analysis. And we should have another public review and comment period. The Corps of Engineers has new information, and so should the public. The undisclosed groundwater withdrawal for the permits in Bullock County to serve the megasite really did make a difference on the level of environmental impacts analysis required. Absent a significance threshold outlined by the Corps of Engineers, we can look at another Department of Defense NEPA example that shows effects on water resources would be considered significant if it reduced the water availability of supply or threatened or damaged hydrology. I think we meet at least those 2 criteria. It also goes on to say that impacts on utility infrastructure will be considered significant if the proposed action increased demand on utilities so that systems were unable to keep up with the demand, Well, I think we clearly meet that definition. We had to install groundwater wells to get the water to the site fast enough because utilities did not exist. We had to put in new water main transmission lines. And now we're putting in $500 million of surface water infrastructure to serve the growing needs of coastal Georgia. So it's been 6 months since the Corps asked the JDA for more information about groundwater demands for the site and how that would impact both ground and surface water. Where is the public update? We haven't seen one yet. We can see the Corps is supposed to have 15 days to determine if the permit info is sufficient, and if anything constitutes a substantial change, a new joint public notice should be issued to start a new round of public review and comment. Comments received during the initial public review and comment period back in 2019 asked for a public hearing, but one was not held. The project has changed substantially since then, and an updated joint public notice is required. The joint public notice is supposed to include evaluation factors, which back in 2022 for this current permit, it did, which included water supply and conservation and water quality. We can also see that the change in scope from the original environmental review for a gas-powered auto plant in 2019 to an EV plant in 2022 should have been a new permit, not just a permit modification. The site grew by hundreds of acres, and the groundwater known to be required at the time of the permit application update both should have driven a fresh start. This is the risk you take of starting environmental review and site prep for a project when you don't have all the details yet. So what's next with the Corps of Engineers? Right now, they're taking a look at what the JDA submitted to them. They provided that information to the Corps about the water needs to the site. CCU filed a FOIA request and received a copy of this information on March 4th. The JDA submitted to the Corps the same modeling done by the state. Open records request revealed the inadequacy of the state's modeling and water management plans. The Georgia Comprehensive Statewide Water Management Plan is dated 2008, more than 15 years old. There was a saltwater intrusion study performed back in 2010, but the water plan was not updated to be informed by that saltwater study. And the state only has one draft version of that. That draft saltwater study is the basis for the groundwater modeling in coastal Georgia, though it was developed to measure saltwater intrusion at Hilton Head Island, not necessarily measure impacts to Georgia. Again, the state groundwater impacts analysis for the Bullock wells does not meet the Corps of Engineers' federal requirement to consider cumulative impacts of the project. Through our open records request, it's been revealed the state groundwater modeling for coastal Georgia is based on that draft 2010 saltwater intrusion study that measured impacts at Hilton Head. And it's singular focused. It looks at individual proposed permits, not even including other permits EPD knows it's issuing at the same time. As you can see, it's not just the wells in Bullock County that will add strain to the aquifer. EPD issued a draft permit to plug power to draw 1.1 million gallons per day in Camden County. The Twin Pines Mineral Project near Okefenokee, quite controversial, also had a draft permit issued for 1.4 million gallons per day. And to give you context of why the flawed modeling for coastal Georgia matters, analysis from Georgia EPD's own groundwater modeling results show that the proposed withdrawals from 2 new wells for Twin Pines mining would extend beyond Bullock County. That's right, the impacts for their proposed 1.4 million gallons per day monthly average alone, not the proposed mine pit dewatering or the 4 new wells in Bullock County. That would extend through the entire Okefenokee, but also throughout Georgia's coastal marshes and throughout Bullock and Bryan County. But the good news is, according to this Figure 3 of Georgia EPD's drawdown contours from their modeling results for the 2 new wells for Twin Pines, that drawdown does not affect Hilton Head Island. Impacts from proposed drawdown in Twin Pines minerals will not be observed on Hilton Head Island. Hallelujah! Is that what we're worried about? And let's touch back to that new regional water plan that's shaping up with the $500 million of surface water infrastructure that the state's about to invest in coastal Georgia. The additional pumping from surface water and the pumping that's being permitted and others proposed and draft permits let by the state All of that should go into cumulative impacts analysis. Now let's dig in a little bit more to this new regional water plan that's shaping up for coastal Georgia. It's going to come in 2 phases. First, additional surface water withdrawal from Abercorn Creek, a tributary of the Savannah River. And in the second phase, additional withdrawal from the Savannah River itself. Now, we've also seen recently in the news how the city of Savannah is suing nearly 50 companies for discharging PFAS, these forever chemicals, into the Savannah River that the city says it does not have current treatment technology to remove. So we're going to increase our potable water infrastructure coming from a known polluted source because we've stressed our aquifer for industry? So what is there left to do? While the Corps of Engineers continues to take a look at the information the JDA provided them, let them know how you feel. We need a new joint public notice based on this updated information. The citizens deserve the ability to make public comments on this new water info regarding groundwater issues for the site. Give them a call, send them an email. I think they deserve to hear from us.